My name's Joe Ullman. I am a hemp grower and breeder in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. I'm currently focusing on autoflower CBD genetics, and I have a BS in plant biology, and I've been working out in the California cannabis industry this will be my 9th year, coming up on our 9th harvest outside, and it's be my first year in Pennsylvania.
And so, can you talk about the differences between the West Coast and the East Coast growing conditions?
Sure. The West Coast is a lot more dry than it is here. We obviously are pretty humid, and we get a lot of rain here, and that's going to definitely affect harvest. I would imagine we're in the middle of August right now. People are just starting to see their buds form. The flowers are forming. We're probably around about week 2 of flower, and we probably have anywhere from 6.5 to 8.5 weeks to go for most people. And in that time, the flowers are going to be growing in size and becoming more ripe. And that's usually a time when mold and disease pressure can start to build. And that's something that we are going to have to be real cognizant of as we go forward through these next couple months.
This is the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. My name is Eric Harlock, and on today's show, we talk about harvesting and drying. First with Joe Ullman from Bucks County Hemp Company, and then we check in with Landin Butterfield, the Director of Operations at Swan Lake Farm in Klamath Falls, Oregon. These guys offer a wealth of knowledge. They've got years of firsthand experience with harvesting and drying CBD hemp. It's a fairly long episode, so get comfortable. It's chock full of good information on harvesting, drying, curing, packaging, and storing, plus ways to deal with mold in the field. Hello, listeners. So you've noticed I haven't had ads lately, right? Past couple weeks, no ads. That's fine. I'm not so into ads myself, but sometimes you have to get a message across. So the message that I guess I'm placing this ad. This is an ad from me to you, and it's about the summit in Lancaster this October. It's called the Pennsylvania Hemp Summit, and it's going to take place at the Lancaster Convention Center. Now, I don't know how much you know about the city of Lancaster, but it's a great place. It's historic and old, but it's also young and progressive. It's walkable and friendly. It's a city full of great people, music, and food. And so the summit takes place at the Convention Center, which is conveniently located at the Lancaster Marriott at Penn Square, which is right downtown in Lancaster. So here's what you can do. You get a room at the hotel for Monday, October 7th, and then you come to the summit reception Monday evening at 5:30, where we will be taping a live episode of the podcast with featured guests and sort of an open mic for hemp growers and also a live band. And then after the show, you can go out for dinner at one of the great Lancaster restaurants nearby. And then you can spend the whole next day at the expo, networking with hemp people, listening to the breakout panel discussions, and generally being a part of what is essentially an industrial hemp harvest party for our first year of full-scale hemp in Pennsylvania. And you got to admit that what's happening here in Pennsylvania, as far as industrial hemp goes, is totally worth celebrating. So you can get more details at teampa.com/PA Hemp Summit. Okay, back to the show. All right, it's the middle of August. It's not quite harvest season yet, but it's on the horizon. You got to be ready for that. You got to have a plan. And for a lot of growers in Pennsylvania, this is the very first harvest they've come into for CBD hemp, which is why I thought we would talk to Joe Ullman and get his take on the harvest. So, Joe, what can you tell us about the harvest?
Well, the actual harvest day is a pretty jam-packed day. I was thinking about if most people are growing in their fields, and they're going to probably hand harvest, and then they're going to transport the plants to their drying space, which hopefully is close by. Ideally, right next to the field would be fantastic, but somewhere on the farm or down the road. The further you have to go, the more of a pain it's going to be, and quality could suffer. But let's assume it's on the farm. You're going to cut it in the field, and you're going to have a team doing that. A team of people. Don't know how big your fields are, but several to maybe many people on the harvesting crew. Then I always like to be in the transporting part of it, which would be driving the tractor or the mule or the pickup, and taking the product up to the drying room. And then you have another team. You should have another team up on that drying room space, and you're hanging the plant essentially. It's nice to be. I've always found it's nice to be in that transport phase as the manner as the leader of the whole harvest crew, because you get to see both aspects, and you're able to push on the gas or let off the gas at different, right. Direct the crew. You really want to harvest it and get it up and hang it in the short amount of time as possible. Let's get back to the team in the field. So they're harvesting the hand pruners. What's the tool, the trade here? I actually I like tobacco harvesting shears. Those are nice because they have that angle. But you could use Felcos. You could use anything. Just cut the stalk down, and then this is where it can get a lot more. I don't want to say complicated, but you have a lot of options when you're. The shortest amount of time would be you cut the plant and you go and hang it, and you don't break it down. You don't take anything off of it. That's the most ideal because that's the least amount of time. However, I would suspect here on the East Coast, we're going to probably be having to deal with some disease pressure. And the most common thing I think that growers are going to see is going to be a gray mold or a botrytis mold. That could be growing in the buds. So you would see the mold in the bud itself, like out in the field. You would see it because you just know. I mean, that's really good growers are walking their fields every day, and they're feeling they're attached to the crop they're growing. Mm-hmm. If the crop's starting to, the health is if there's an infection, you kind of. It's on your mind. You're out there looking at it. So inspecting your crop is really important. So you can take kind of a pulse of where you're at, and that way you're not surprised all the way down the line. Say with a moldy drying room, which is what we want to avoid. If you find gray mold in there, cut it out. I like to call the task mold patrol. I think mold patrol starts. Every morning at sunup, every day from 3 or 4 weeks out from harvest, and you're just walking through your crop and looking. And if you see it, that's when you phone a friend or two or an employee, and you go at it together. Because it can be kind of a little psychologically defeating. Oh man, my plants aren't doing well. What's going on? Where did this mold come from? Don't freak out. Just cut it out. Remove it. Ideally with a pair of Fiskars or Felcos. You avoid using your hands and fingers, but sometimes that happens as well. You put on a pair of latex gloves or whatever. When you cut it out, remove it from the patch or the field by putting it into a bucket. Maybe have a 5-gallon bucket at the end of the row. One thing I like to do is take a 1 quart like plastic jug, or mm-hmm. you could cut a milk jug in half, and then tie a string on each end and like loop it around your neck so it's kind of over you. So you're not so you can just kind of pick and put the mold into that, and then that way you don't have to kick around a 5-gallon bucket the whole time. So is mold really prevalent? Should farmers expect to see mold, or is this a rare occurrence? I don't think it's a rare occurrence. I do not think it's a rare occurrence. I think that hemp farmers here in Pennsylvania, now weather dependent, of course, but we we tend to get moisture. If we go 2 weeks without moisture, that's an anomaly.
Right.
And on the West Coast, where we go or have gone, and they still do 4 and 5 months without rain or moisture on the canopy, you still it can still come up. It does still come up, and it's usually strain dependent. And that's something that all these growers in Pennsylvania this year are learning about the strains that they're growing. They've never grown them before. Most people never grown. Yeah. So I wouldn't be surprised if some strains are more susceptible than others. And obviously, choices will be made for the next season. This entire season is basically one giant experiment.
Yeah, right. Okay, so back to harvesting. You're out there in the field with your team. You've got your tobacco shears, and you cut each plant at the stalk. And then what do you do with that plant material?
You can put it into a bin, and like a 30-gallon tote, a Rubbermaid tote, and then you can stack them up on a trailer or on the back of a tractor or in a pickup, and transport them out of your field and to your drying facility or location. Then when you're hanging them, so shipping containers work really well. An 8 by 40 by 9 feet tall. What works well is if you hog fencing. If you cut yourself a piece of hog fence, imagine and hang it inside the shipping container and put different. You're putting racks into the shipping container, and you're filling the racks with plant material. You're hanging it on there, so it provides, maybe every foot you put a new rack, and it provides space in between the plant material for air movement, because you need that for proper drying. Imagine in your let's say your shipping container, you had rails going down the both lengths of the container, and maybe 1 foot from the top, and you cut a little nub on the end of your hog fencing so that you could hang it on that rail. And another way you can go about it is, say you're in a barn and you're going to hang from the rafters. The way to use all that space is to take nylon. Let's say you take, or not nylon, plastic tomato netting. That's kind of rigid. So you zip tie it to the rafter or to the in the barn, and then you unfurl it down to about a foot from the floor, and then weight that bottom. You could weight it with an old piece of PVC or a 2x4, and zip tie it. And now you have a rack, another rack essentially, and you can hang in. I think those squares are 6 by 6, so you can you basically fill up your wall, and you don't. It's hard to explain without actually being there what's too full and what's not full enough. And generally, though, you can not be able to look through your walls of hemp hanging there. And then you want to give a spacing, I would say a minimum of a foot before you put a new rack in. And most barns, they might have like a 16-inch or a 22-inch spacing on their studs. So,
and that leaves enough airflow, because that's the important part of the drying process, is the airflow, right?
Absolutely. A very, very important part of the process. The other very important part is dehumidification.
Okay.
You're going to want to rent or buy. Rent is good. This is the first year. No sense in making a couple $1,000 purchase if you don't have to. I would say I've looked at prices. They're about $300 to $350 for a week. That would be for renting a 180 to 200 pint a day dehumidifier. It's an industrial dehumidifier. Plenty of rental companies put them out there for rent. And you're going to want to have, so you might say, well, how much, how many dehumidifiers do I need? More is better, I would say. In an 8 by 40 shipping container with 40 racks, essentially, one every foot. I will say 39 because you got to be able to get in and out at the end of the door. That whole shipping container will be able to hold roughly 150 pounds of dried material. And in that space, I put one 200-gallon a day, 200 pint a day. That would be 25 gallons, industrial dehumidifier in there, as well as a lot of fans. Okay, now because you need air circulation, you need air movement.
Right.
I would say the best way to do that if you were in a shipping container would be to build a manifold with perforated drain pipe.
Okay.
You follow me? And you can run it down the length of the ceiling, and you could run it down the length of the floor. And then you could connect that to an 8 or a 10-inch fan and exhaust fan, and you could duct it in, and that way it's going to be pushing air throughout the whole shipping container.
Got it.
If you're not in a shipping container and you're in a barn and you have access to your crop, say from 3 or 4 sides, you can put floor fans, high velocity floor fans, to move air from, think top to bottom. You want to circulate the air. Maybe you run it down one way on one side and back up the other way on the other side of your to kind of circulate the air. I will say this: direct from a quality standpoint, direct wind is not as ideal as diffuse wind or indirect. That is because of terpenes. And that might be a whole nother topic that we could get into one day. But in general, the smell, the aroma of your plants is, as they're ripening, are the terpenes that are in there. And basically, this industry right now is really concerned with cannabinoids and specifically CBD. But there's a whole nother side to that whole quality equation. And that ultimately buyers, when you're selling your product, whether you're at a broker or you found a distributor, they're going to they should want to pay more. Now, I'm not saying they always will, but they should want to pay more for a better smelling, better looking product. And I have talked to people that get a few points higher because their product. This is in Oregon because their product is better.
Is there anything you can do in the field while harvesting that will sort of protect the plant material? Like how delicate do you have to be with handling it?
You don't have to be delicate at all. You don't want to smash the flowers. So be careful when you're filling the bins. You generally halfway full is a good amount, but of course, if you have a long, harvest days are long and people get tired, especially after lunch, the crew slows down, and that can, cause the manager or the owner to be like, come on guys, we got to get this done. And okay, well, we'll fill. In the morning, we were only filling our bins halfway because we didn't want to smush the bottom flowers. Well, okay, fill them up all the way. And, decisions like that happen all the time. And
priorities change after lunch.
Yeah, priorities change, and it's not the end of the world. But, yes, in general, you don't want to smash your plants. You want them to dry. Of course, here's the other reality of this. What are people's end goals with their product? Are they going straight to extraction? I've seen people just chop up the entire plant with the stalk and all the flower and all the leaves, all the water leaves, all the fan leaves as well, and sell that to an extractor. Now, I bet, and I know this from the cannabis side of things in California, extractors will pay more for a better quality input. Those stalks and all those water leaves and fan leaves, there's not many cannabinoids in those. There's more in the flower. So if you were to only sell the flower, which means shucking or bucking the flower off of the stalk after it's dried. I recommend after it's dried, not before. It's just easier to hang and dry something when it's on a stalk. That's a way that growers here can increase the quality of their product. Then, of course, there's smokable flower, which people are starting to get into. I've definitely heard that going around in PA here. There's a marketplace for that. That definitely means that you're going to be taking even more care of your flower, and you're going to be trimming it up and manicuring it essentially before you sell it. So you don't want to smash your flower in the field, and you want to get your flower from the field up into your drying space, in a quick amount of time as possible.
All right. Well, that's helpful. I think some growers out there will really appreciate your insight.
Yeah, there's one other thing about the temperature in your drying room. So the dehumidifier is going to put off some heat. That's not a bad thing. In the first 24 to 36 hours of finishing packing full the drying room, I like to get a little heat in there. And when I say a little heat, I mean 85 would be perfect if I could keep it at 85. Dry electric heat is obviously better than, say, if you put a propane heater in there, you're going to also add water in there or moisture, which isn't ideal, but I'll try to avoid that if you can. But the reason putting heat in there is to, quote unquote, break the back of the drying process. It's those first 24 to 36 hours that if you don't have ample airflow and dehumidification in there, and let's say you decided not to remove any gray mold or botrytis mold that's in your buds, now you've packed in your drying shed or your drying container or whatever it is with inoculum that could spread. And I've seen that happen countless times. Early on, it happened to me in my first couple harvests. And you learn that you really want to put the time in on the front end to put the best material that you have, that you've spent all season growing and you've put your blood, sweat, and tears into. You want to put the best material into your drying area. So I really would recommend spending the time and the labor to do that. Let's hope that you don't have to, that it's just the most perfect harvest. You grew the best strain. There's no mold. They're beautiful, big Christmas trees. But that, probably isn't going to be a reality here in this West or in this East Coast climate.
So what, the heater at 85, that's going to help keep the mold from spreading? Is that right?
Yeah, it's going to help the drying process. You're going to dry it out. You want to dry out. You got to remember that the edges are going to dry first, the edges of the flower, the outer leaves, and then it's going to take this whole drying process should take you somewhere between 7 to 14 days.
Okay.
Low and slow is better for quality. Remember, those terpenes are going to volatilize and disappear. Mm-hmm. But I've seen good quality come out at 7 days. I prefer a little longer, 12 to 14 days. It just all depends on your available space. Maybe you're doubling up your drying room and you're trying to do 2 runs of drying in there, so you got to move it out. Because of that, you want to really focus on those first 36 hours. 85 degrees. If it goes to 90, it's not the end of the world, but we're not talking 110. And you're dehumidifying in there, and then once you feel that the moisture. Okay, here's the test. You go in, you find your stalk, not your main stalk, but your a branch stalk. Maybe it's a pencil in diameter. Maybe it's bigger. Find the pencil ones, and can you snap them? Do they snap?
Okay. And
if they snap, if they don't snap and they're pliable, there's still moisture in there. A lot of this is trial and errors. I can tell you, but unless you see it yourself, you're really not going to fully comprehend what this whole process is like. But at that point, when the stems snap, you can back off on your heat. You can remove your heat. Ideally, you want to leave it 70 degrees. If it was at 60% humidity and 70 degrees, you're great. You're in a nice stasis.
What did you mean by break the back? You used that phrase a minute ago.
I mean that you really want to get over the hump with getting that initial amount of moisture out of that drying area. Yeah, I don't want extra moisture to be in there for any longer than it needs to be. Another way to remove extra moisture is to take the time to to take off some of the fan leaves. You're taking that's before you put it in. You're ripping off some of the fan leaves. They pop off if you go opposite of the way they're growing on the stalk pretty easily, and you can de-leaf a plant fairly quickly, and then hang it, and you're removing vegetative material from your drying space, which is going to mean you have to do less drying.
All right, that's Joe Ullman from Bucks County Hemp Company, sharing his insight on harvesting and drying. Next up, we're going to Klamath Falls, Oregon to check in with hemp farmer Landin Butterfield. You'll notice some redundancy here, information that Joe also shared, but I think it's helpful to hear these things from more than one person, from more than one perspective, but also notice that there are some differences in the approach that these two farmers take. So I hope you find this enlightening and educational. Landin Butterfield, welcome to the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. Could you introduce yourself for us?
My name's Landin Butterfield. I'm the Director of Operations for Swan Lake Farms in Klamath Falls, Oregon, and I'm a hemp farmer.
Yeah, well, you got in touch after last week's episode when I had mentioned that I was putting together an episode about drying and harvesting, and you sort of volunteered your expertise in that, which is great because there's, a lot of folks on this side of the country who are doing this for the very first time, but you're out in Oregon, and your whole hemp culture is a little more mature than ours. So any insight you can share with our listeners would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. We are very well steeped in hemp culture out here in Southern Oregon, going back a long time. But I did reach out because I wanted to, provide some information and, hopefully help some people avoid some expensive mistakes here.
So first, let's talk about like what sort of style you're growing in. Are you large production? Are you small acreage?
Yes, we have 220 acres under cultivation. It's in bare ground, under pivots, so no drip tape, no plastic mulch. We're trying to avoid, the waste and the extra expense on that.
So when you say pivots, that's like an irrigation circle that you see from the airplanes. Yeah, we don't really have a lot of those out this way in Pennsylvania, but it's like when you fly over, you see those great big circles down there. Okay.
Yeah. We have a lot of those here in K Falls, and it's a common piece of infrastructure. So we're trying to make that work for the farmers that already have one.
Okay. And how big of an area does that pivot cover?
About 100 acres each. We have one that we refer to as the Pac-Man pivot. It's not a full circle, and it covers a 95 or 96 acre area. And then our larger pivot is a full circle, and it covers about 120, but we only cultivate about 110 of that.
And then as far as plants in the field go, like what's your spacing like? What are the rows?
We went with a standard 4x6 spacing, so there's a 4-foot space between each plant in the rows, and there's a 6-foot space between the rows, so we can fit, a small UTV or a orchard tractor down them.
And you said that's bare ground underneath, or do you have a cover crop in there? No.
We did have some vetch down over the fall, and we cut that up in the spring here, but just due to some circumstances beyond our control, Mother Nature, we weren't able to get another cover crop down before we got into our main planting phase. So we've just been cultivating in between the rows to keep the weeds down.
Cool. All right. So harvesting. Let's get into that a little bit. So how do you know when it's ready to harvest? Like what are the indications? Sure.
Well, with the hemp plant, you'll obviously see it start to go into flower about now. We're in transition, or some of our fields that get more shadow are. And when those flowers have reached a density that the farmer is happy with, a size and density, that's typically, the main indicator. With hemp, you also have the federal oversight of the THC levels. So I would advise most farmers to be spot checking their field, if possible, throughout August and into September up to their harvest window, watching for both the CBD percentages and the THC percentages. You want to avoid a THC spike, and CBD comes on a little bit earlier than the THC anyway. So if you can find that happy window, that's kind of one of the big ones. Honestly, the next... Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to ask, are you testing every few days, or how do you keep track of those cannabinoid levels?
Yeah, we're testing about once a week. Starting here this week, we go out and take one tissue sample per 5 to 10 acres. It's not a super detailed sampling. It's just enough to give you an idea of what's going on in the field.
And then what's the turnaround time on the results of that test?
Well, the machine we're using is on site, immediate. It's just you take a tissue sample, you pop it in, it runs a few things, and then it just returns a response.
Wow. What's that machine called?
I'm going to have to go check that. I was meaning to look at the name of it yesterday, and I forgot.
All right, we'll come back to that. But
yeah.
that's very interesting. I didn't know.
I can tell you there are a couple on the market, and I don't know, depending on where your listeners are, I don't know exactly, what companies are big in their area, but definitely There's going to be some local guys that are probably capable of that.
Cool.
The one thing I would like to stress on that, it's not an accredited test in my state, so I can't use it for the state regulations for CBD THC testing. So you still have to bring in an accredited lab for that.
Right, but it's helpful in the field to sort of know where you are. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's cool. Okay, so you've got the field test. You have the look of the flowers in the field. Are there other indicators to let you know that it's time to harvest?
Really, once we've come into heavy flower in September and we're pushing towards, October, the weather's going to be the largest dictator. The plants start to get really heavy as they get wet. If wet weather or wind comes in, you have a substantial chance of branch breakage or just losing the entire plant. So also mold becomes a larger concern as we get later into the colder, wetter part of the season. So really, if the weather outlook's not looking good for the next week or two and you're in late September, it's probably time to consider cutting, because you really don't want to bring that mold into your dry room if you can help it.
Right. So when you cut, is that all by hand, or are you doing that with machines? How's that work?
Sure. Well, we're focusing on the farm this year on both what they're referring to as smokable CBD flower and the CBD biomass for extraction. Mm-hmm. CBD biomass for extraction is simple. We have a combine that can cut it down 60 acres a day. We've got an Oracle baler that's capable of producing a compression bale that I personally have seen store quote-unquote wet material for 9 months without really any degradation.
Wow.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. Why reinvent the wheel? There's all these amazing agricultural technologies out there already. So, yeah, that buys us the wiggle room, with the biomass to just go in there and chop it all down. Smokable hemp flower is a totally different story. We've been traditionally treating that like cannabis flower, mm-hmm. and that is a very time-consuming, labor-intensive process. The flower is delicate. It's very easy to bruise when it's in its wet state, so you do have to come into the field and cut it by hand, and then fairly delicately transport it to your drying facility, by use of bins or something like that. Your typical field harvest would look like however many people you can get. I think we had 200 people for last year's harvest. Obviously, if your scale's smaller, you'll have fewer people. Mm-hmm. Identify early on the sections you'd like to hand harvest. The farmer will see throughout the season where the flowers are biggest and densest and, the best. And you send them out to cut roughly 1.5 to 2 foot sections of the plant off, going for mostly the top flowers, what's referred to as the colas. Depending on if you're hang drying or if you're screen drying, will dictate how you cut the flower. So if you're screen drying, you're going to take slightly smaller sections because you're going to lay them out flat on a screen in your drying facility. Mm-hmm. If you're going to be hang drying, you can take slightly longer sections, and specifically you want to try and cut to the main stalk so you can get what we call the check mark to give yourself something to hang. It's a very simple thing, but it actually really saves a lot of time on the other end having that check mark. And that's really it. You send the guys out with some heavy-duty shears, have them start clipping flowers. bring them to a tote or a central location, get them on a trailer, and send them off to the dry facility.
Okay, so there's a few things there I want to go back to.
Yeah,
so,
unpack.
Yeah, when you're cutting for the flower, you said you're just taking like a 1.5 2 foot of the top of the plant. You're leaving the rest of the plant in the field?
More or less. So if you are cutting just for flower, then you want to take as much of that plant as you see as viable flower. Bear in mind, they will lose about 80% of their mass upon drying, so you really do only want to go for the bigger ones. If you're going for biomass as well as flower, then you really, really, really only select the very best of the best and leave everything else to get chopped.
Now, and explain the check mark thing again.
Certainly. So if you were to stand directly over a hemp plant, look down at it, you'll notice that the branch nodes come out, in kind of a spiral pattern around the plant. Each one of those branches usually contains a pretty decent sized flower, and given the size of a lot of people's hemp crops, you can get away with cutting just that branch right at the stalk of the plant. So you basically just take the plant stalk off, and because you've been doing that all the way down, you're left with an inch or two of plant stalk attached to 1.5 to 2 feet of flowering branch. And that check mark of the stalk, it looks like a check mark when you're holding it up. It gives you something to hang on when you're in your drying facility, whether you're using trellis netting or a large, pig screen or something. It makes it so your guys can hang that really, really quickly.
Got it. So it just sort of becomes the hanging infrastructure right in the plant. Like
exactly. Otherwise, you have to hang it from a flower node, which doesn't always hold.
Is there any way to break down like a ratio between acres and labor hours?
Kind of. Yeah, we definitely had some crews that were significantly faster than others last year, enough to throw our average a little bit. But 15 people were able to do 5 to 6 acres a day of hand harvest of flower, typically, and that's pretty thorough harvest. That's going through and taking the bulk of the flower off the plant.
All right. And then you said you need to be really careful with the flowers. Yeah,
they bruise easy and they get flat. So I would always recommend using a smaller, like a 27-gallon tote's real popular over here, but something about that size to move your flower from the plant to your staging area, because those bins, you can't fill them overly full to crush the flowers on the bottom. They won't hit critical mass before they're full and need to be taken in.
Okay.
So it makes it easier for your field hands, because they don't have to necessarily concentrate on, do I have too much in here or whatever. It's just, it's full, send it on down the line.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, that's very helpful. And then let's talk about drying. I know some people have mechanical drying, other people just hang it and dry. What do you have experience with? What do you recommend?
Yeah, I've hung dry. I've dried on screens. I've dried mechanically. I've dried in barns and horse arenas and garages and storage containers and houses. I think we even once dried a little bit in a car. So, you can do it in just about any space that you are able to control the environment in. Mm-hmm. The key to any kind of drying of this plant is air movement. If you're in a mechanical dryer, it's going to be key that your fans are working properly and that your air is flowing at the temperature and in the places that, you need it to. And then as far as, drying non-mechanically, hanging or on screens, then you're looking at making sure that you have enough fans and, in most cases, dehumidification to deal with that space. What that usually looks like is you're going to have usually rows upon rows of either racks or some sort of screen or netting hanging, down vertically for you to hang from. And then I would recommend having your dehumidification, if you can, mount it up near the ceiling. That always is the best, because your warm, humid air is kind of going to congregate up there. If you can't mount it up near the ceiling, a fan to push the air down is always good. And more fans is almost always better. I mean, there is too much air movement, and you'll see that if the plant starts to dry out a little quick, but the goal is to move the wet air away from the flower quickly and replace that with dry air to continue the wicking, pulling the moisture out.
Is there a way to measure the moisture content? Like, how do you know when it's dried to the right spot?
Sure. You can use a probe. There's many of them on the market. You can get them on Amazon for $20 or $30. Just a simple little metal probe that you stick into the flower or the stem, and it'll give you a moisture reading. Under 15% is kind of the golden standard. Down to 12, and you start to get away from the amount of moisture that mold needs. So, us old school guys, we'll walk in and we'll start squeezing stuff. It'll be dry to the touch, but not like crumbling. Mm-hmm. And the most important thing, and the thing that I always come back to, and one of the first things I was taught, is the stalk will snap. Not bend, but actually snap.
When it's ready.
When it's ready, yep.
Okay.
You take one of the smaller branches that you have a little flower on, and you just, and you just snap it, and it'll either bend or it'll give you a good crack.
Is dust a concern in these drying areas? And the reason I ask that is because there's a lot of guys here who, have old barns that they're figuring on drying in, and these can get dusty. They've had hay in them for 100 years or whatever. What should people consider when they're drying in old barns?
Sure. Well, first of all, a good clean out if you have the time. A lot of these old hay barns, the dust usually is pretty settled. So once you start getting activity in there, it starts getting disturbed. Mm-hmm. So if you can clean it out before you get in there, that's always ideal. I recommend tarps or visqueen plastic or painter's plastic or something like that if you're on a gravel or a dirt floor that you're worried about, kicking up a lot of dust as you're moving
Mm-hmm.
around in there.
Yeah.
The side benefit of that is anything that falls off of your hanging racks isn't immediately in the dirt.
Right.
So, the other thing is just to kind of, if you're in a barn that's going to be dusty, you just have to minimize the activity in there because that dust will stick to the trichomes of the flower. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be a level where it does impact the quality, but you do have, a little bit of breathing room on that. So yeah, I would say put down something for a dirt floor or a gravel floor if you can. Mm-hmm. If you got a shop vac or a dust blower, not a dust blower, just a leaf blower or something like that, and you can give, things a good blowout of the cobwebs and everything kind of while you're setting everything up, I'd advise that. I mean, the reality is most farmers are going to have to use whatever infrastructure they have. And so instead of going and building a new building, I think a decent clean out on most of these old ones will be fine. I haven't had a problem necessarily with smell or anything coming off these as long as you take proper precautions.
Now, here's a question that might only be Pennsylvania specific. What about farmers who aren't using electricity? Is there anything you can recommend for drying the hemp flowers without plugging fans in or dehumidifiers?
Well, airflow. If you're in a situation where you don't have the electricity to run the fans and all the other toys, then you're going to really need to focus on putting it in a place where you can still control that airflow. You'll want a constant, steady breeze to move through, and then hope that the humidity stays fairly low. The ambient humidity stays fairly low. It's kind of tricky to do because in that first 24 hours they off-gas a lot of their moisture, and that's kind of a critical point when you really want to make sure that you have that air movement. Historically what we did is we'd run generators in areas where we didn't have power so that we could have those fans and have those dehumidifiers and possibly a heater depending on the climate. I've done a lot of grows up in the mountains and stuff that are very, very remote. And we've almost always at least run a generator. Okay. Not saying it can't be done. It adds a level of difficulty that I'm not sure a first-time farmer would really want to do.
Okay. And how long should we expect the drying process to take?
Sure. Typically 3 to 5 days if you're able to control your humidity really well. It can take up to 7 to 10 if, ambient air is really moist and, conditions just aren't ideal. 3 days is about as fast as you'd want to go. You do get some terpene damage. And if you go faster than that, and it will kind of ruin the smell on it.
Okay.
At least for smokable flower. On the biomass, it's a totally different story. You can dry that in, 24 to 36 hours pretty easy and without any problem.
So then it's dry. How about like packaging, or, what's the next step after that? Like, how do you put it together to send to a processor, or maybe you've got a processor on site? What happens next?
Sure. Well, and this is why, again, it's such a labor-intensive process. So your flower is dry, and it's in your, facility. It's hanging. The next step is taking it down and getting it off the stalk. And this, kind of depends on how your processor or your buyer actually wants it. But typically the process would be shucking, removing it from the stalk and getting the flower individual. And then we actually cured ours, which is a 2-week to 4-week process, which is pulling the last little bit of moisture out of the very center of the flower, and it stabilizes the flower, gives it a longer shelf life. And that's where you hear the terms like burping, because you package your flower in, we used lined super sacks, the little half-ton super sacks with a plastic liner. And we, filled those about half full, because, again, you don't want to crush the stuff on the bottom.
Right.
And then, set them aside. And I had 4 guys that I paid 40 hours a week to walk around and open those bags and check them and let the air exchange between what's in the bag and what's out in the environment. And then they closed it back up. And you do that for 2 weeks to a month.
And that's the curing process.
That's curing process. I would highly recommend any farmers wanting to do a smokable hemp flower look into curing, because that's the process that's going to give your flower that quality that's going to help set it apart from the rest of the market. It helps lock the smell in, the taste, the look, all of that.
Okay.
Yeah, once it's cured, trimming. Some people, well, let me go back. Some people will debate. Some people like to trim before it's cured. Some people like to trim after it's cured. I've done it both ways. I think whatever works best for your situation is the way you should do it. But trimming is just removing the larger, what we call fan leaves or water leaves off of the plant, so that it's just the nice looking tight flower. We did it mechanically with a line of Twister T2s. There are literally dozens of mechanical trimmers on the market. Most of them of a similar type. And, again, I can't necessarily recommend one over another. It just comes down to, what your price point is and what you need from the machine, because they all do things a little different, and that all works for, different people.
Sure.
I would say that I would look into mechanically trimming it, unless you are, 5 acres or less. Even up to 5 acres, you might want to look into mechanically trimming, because hand trimming ends up being fairly expensive and very time consuming.
Okay.
So, yeah, and the mechanical trimmers can do, I think we were doing 1,000 pounds a day with our trimmer line.
Yeah, from what I'm gathering here in Pennsylvania, a lot of the CBD grows are relatively small, a few acres here, a few acres there, but then there are sort of like farmer collectives where they're working with, like 50 farmers with little plots. That's all going to go to a central processing. So, yeah, that's great information for them.
Good. Yeah, and if your operation is small enough and your yield is, of a certain amount, then you can probably get away with hand trimming it, and the expense isn't going to, be that bad. I just noticed for a lot of farmers with scaling, that upfront expense in the fall, after you've already run the whole summer, can be kind of crippling to some.
Is it just the labor costs? Or are there other reasons why you would lean towards mechanical trimming?
Basically, it's the labor costs and the amount of time in processing. It's a problem of scalability. It's a big argument here in Southern Oregon, which is better. And I think traditionally a lot of people would say that the hand trimming, has a better look and feel and stuff like that. And I do understand that. But when you're dealing with these large amounts, you need to process it quickly. And also, what I hope a lot of farmers realize is that, in this industry, you tend to, if you want to make the best on your crop, you're not going to get paid until March, because you're going to put out all this money in spring, you're going to put out all this money in summer, you're putting out all this money in the fall to bring it in and harvest it. And all this overhead is building up. And every other farmer, just like you out there, is traditionally going to unload their harvest right before Christmas. Prices are traditionally always low, and they don't come back up until, February, March, April. And so you end up sitting on this product for 6 months after you harvest it if you want to get, top dollar. So the machine trimming just saves you so much money in that upfront cost. As much as I like the hand trimming, it ends up being exceptionally expensive.
And that getting paid until March, that's like a supply and demand thing. That's like you wait until the prices are good and then you can make, okay. Cool. That makes sense.
Yeah. You're waiting out everybody else.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Landin, is there anything else we should talk about as far as drying or harvesting, or any other insight you can share?
Yeah, right. I want to touch on packaging real quick.
Yep.
Once you've spent all this time to harvest it and dry it proper and cure it proper and trim it, storage is going to be really important. You want to store it in a bag that blocks UV. You want to store it in a cool, dry, fairly environment-controlled facility. You definitely want to store it out of direct sunlight. And, we have taken to nitrogen purging or a vacuum-sealed bag, and that gives you a very, very good shelf life on the product to sit through those long winter months. And I really can't stress enough that, proper storage after the fact saves all that work.
Right. Okay, so before we wrap things up, if listeners have more questions for you, is there a way that they can reach you directly?
Yeah, they can reach me at my company email. That's Landin, L as in Lima, A as in Alpha, N as in November, D as in Delta, I as in India, N as in November, at SwanLakeFarmsLLC.com.
All right, and I'll have that email address on the show page for this episode at LancasterFarming.com. Okay, well, that's pretty much the show. Hope you learned something. I know I did. Thank you both, Joe and Landin, for sharing your insight, and I expect we'll hear from these guys again on future episodes. Okay, so just a few things before we wrap it up. Last week I mentioned a national hemp seed bank that's being created in New York State. I heard from a few listeners who were leery of this because of Big Ag's involvement, and they recommend that I explore the Philo story and the controversy over genetics and intellectual property and Big Ag's involvement in industrial hemp. It's fascinating stuff, and I am looking into it. Also, on a more local level, just a reminder that there is an all-day hemp workshop Wednesday, August 28th at the Cedar Meadow Farm Education Center in Holtwood, Lancaster County. More information is available at hempinnovators.com. And also, I will be in upstate New York for a few days soon. So if there are any hemp farmers near Prattsburgh, New York, send me an email at podcast@lancasterfarming.com, and maybe I can schedule a time to stop by and visit the farm. Well, all right. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. I do appreciate it. My name is Eric Herlock. I am the digital editor at Lancaster Farming Newspaper, the best agricultural newspaper in the world. Check us out online at lancasterfarming.com. Also, I can always be reached by email, podcast@lancasterfarming.com. You can also follow us on Instagram at LFPodcastHemp. Also, leave us a review. We're on your podcast app. Appreciate that. So, okay, until next time, I'll see you in the newspaper. This episode of the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast is copyright 2019 by Lancaster Farming, which is part of the Steinman Communications family. Today's show was written, recorded, edited, and produced by Eric Herlock. Any music you heard was courtesy of the Tin Bird Shadow.
Industrial hemp, industrial hemp, industrial hemp, industrial hemp, industrial hemp, industrial hemp.